Hello, good morning and good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be joining us from. First of all, thank you for joining us today. I'm excited. We have a really great panel with us here to unpack a few hot topics from the recent report by the Linux Foundation called Open Source Maturity in Europe. We're going to talk about how a few of these trends may ripple across the globe and also into 2025. So my name is Aaron Branson. I'm head of community and content for FOSS-ID. I'm here as the facilitator for this conversation. So let me just get right into it and introduce our panelists and a bit about the format. Flip ahead here. So yeah, we had a little bit of a change at the last second here, but we still have Mirko Bohm, Senior Director for Community Development at the Linux Foundation Europe, Adrian Lawson, a data analyst at the Linux Foundation, both of whom were involved in the creation of the report we're going to talk about. Unfortunately, Gary Armstrong, Senior Director of Operations at FOSS-ID, had a family emergency like 30 minutes ago, so he's unable to join us. But keep him in your prayers, please, that everything goes smoothly and is ironed out. But we are still good to go. Let's go ahead and look at what we're talking about today. So we've shared this full report in the last email that you got, the last reminder for this webinar. I also just dropped the link in the chat, but you'll also get it in the follow-up email as well. The full report covers 12 topics, a lot. But just for today, and today's focus is going to be on four particular topics that we at FOSS-ID found particularly interesting. First, if you look at the top row of your screen, open source security confidence. Second, down and to the left, we'll talk about the role of OSPOs, open source program offices, in fostering that open source collaboration. And third, in the bottom right, we'll get into how all of this impacts the startup community in particular. And then lastly, in the bottom left corner, we have the always fun topic of AI that we'll touch on a little bit. So, and just a reminder, before we wrap up the call, we'll have time for Q&A. So there's a question panel in GoToWebinar. Feel free to submit some questions there. I'll be curating those as Mirko and Adrian head up the conversation here, and we'll have some time to read those out and try to answer some questions before we call it a day. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Adrian to provide some context about the overall report and the methodology involved. Adrian?
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for the invitation. It's nice to be here. So as Aaron said, I'm a data analyst at the Linux Foundation research team. Mostly I'm in the quantitative side of research and we do surveys. And I'm going to be talking about one particular survey that we've been doing since 2022. In 2022, there was a focus on Europe. And actually one of the main conclusions of that report was that kind of in Europe, open source is a bit more romanticized than in the US. In the US, there's a lot of commercial factors that are taken into account when people think about open source, and that's a bit different in Europe. So it really showed that research is important to see what are the regional differences in terms of how people and organizations think about open source. And so we expanded the survey to a global survey in 2023 and did the same thing in 2024. And we kind of usually do a Europe spotlight still from knowing what we've done in 2022, as well as a Japan spotlight. And in December, we are going to be sharing our global spotlight, which is focusing on regional differences, one next to each other, as well as the whole global space. But today, I'm going to be talking about the Europe Spotlight 2024, which is, again, packed with many insights. And I was very happy to do this survey with and report with Mirko and Killian Osborne. This survey was fielded in from April till June. We have in the Europe sample 328 organizations who shared our insights with us. And we also incorporated interviews from 2022 experts from sectors such as the public sector to private sectors, as well as academia. And that just gives, I always love mixed methods research because it can give some flavor to the sometimes dry and quantitative side of the surveys. So I'm very happy that Mirko and Killian helped us conducting these interviews. And yes, that would be the context of the research. Thank you.
Got it. Thanks, Adrian. So with that, we're going to dig into the first one of these four areas. Let me jump ahead to the next slide and talk about confidence in security of open source.
Yes. So I think this particular infographic, and we've been showing you 12 infographics before, but we are now focusing on one, which is about OSS security. And I was a bit scared on what the results might be because we had this exact same question in 2023. And I don't know about you, but because of the kind of high profile attacks that were happening in the OSS space this year, I was a bit scared on what the actual results might look like, but confidence remains high from 73% of people saying, yes, I think open source is more secure than closed software. We then get a result of 76% in 2024, which this change can be attributed to margin of error, but we can see that the actual confidence is still high. I don't know, Mirko, did you have any, were you scared about this result at first when?
It's always difficult to ask a question like this because there's a chance that you don't get the answers that you're hoping for. But here, I think we see, as you highlighted, continuing confidence in the security of open source software. And I think for those of you who have been around open source like me for quite some time, you know that this has been a debate for a long time. Is proprietary software more secure, less secure than open source software? And for a long time, the prevalent opinion was, we don't know, we can't really say. Mostly because it was impossible to introspect proprietary software in a similar way as we are analyzing open source software. And I think by now it is quite clear that a strong majority of participants thinks that the fact that there's more transparency, that there are more eyes on the code, and that there's also a lot of scrutiny as software gets deployed, which was the mitigation to some of the attacks this year, that there is a lot of attention on integrating open source software in your products, leads to more secure software. And I think this is a good insight, a very valuable insight, because it helps us direct attention to initiatives that further increase the level of cybersecurity in open source components, like is done in the work of the Open Source Security Foundation. And it's also important to highlight that it's not just the transparency of the source code, but also the collaborative development process that drives the security. More people collaborating will find more security issues, and they will also be able to establish a culture of taking security seriously during the development process. One thing that I think will even further amplify the attention on cybersecurity is the regulatory environment in Europe that we now see, with the final votes on the Cyber Resilience Act that will go into effect in the next couple of years in Europe. There's now a baseline set for cybersecurity practices that everybody has to apply who wants to bring products into the European market. And since we realized that a lot of open source software is in all digital products today, much of this work on cybersecurity will continue to have been done to be done in open source software development.
Nice. Just before jumping to the next topic, I just wanted to add that I do have some results from the global aspect of this, and actually globally, it was 68% of people who said that open source is more secure. So there's definitely a bit of slightly more confidence in Europe actually compared to the global numbers. Just wanted to add.
Oh, that's interesting. All right, great. Thanks for unpacking that. Take a look at what we got next. OSPOs. Why don't you take this one?
Yes, so OSPOs are always so, especially in the surveys, we try to, talk about OSPOs as well as less formalized structures of OSS strategies in organizations. So usually in our surveys, we talk about OSPOs as well as some kind of strategy. And it is true that in the public sector, we usually see a smaller take up of OSPOs or other strategies. And that's, I think, an important finding because in other questions where we ask, which sector do you think is the most important for open source, or which sector should adopt open source the most, usually the public sector comes up first. So this kind of like paradox is always interesting, but I think Mirko can talk a bit more about why this is happening and why there's maybe such a challenge in public sectors to adopt this.
Mhm. So thank you, Adrian. First, maybe we oversimplified here a bit because the findings talk about OSPOs, but we generally talk about or analyze how open source is anchored in an organization at at the level where the organization can be guided in the adoption and contribution to open source. And one of the very popular ways for that is having an OSPO, but sometimes this is also part of other units within an organization. So we're not really hung up on the name. The question really is, does an organization strategically invest in integrating itself into this ecosystem, adapting to it? And here we see a strong pickup, the prevalence of such organizations. And that's more in the private sector so far compared to the public sector. I think that's, usually quite intuitive as well. Like private industry is driving innovation in software technology and hardware, and the public sector is usually using what the private sector is producing. But I think it's also a bit of the public sector is often more adopting and therefore a little bit behind on the curve. There's also a bit of a lost opportunity because the public sector has an inherent alignment with open source. Open source produces public goods, and the public sector provides public goods to society. And so everything we produce should kind of be a perfect match for the public sector. And we're seeing an increased interest here in our conversations. And it involves not just the public sector as an adopter of open source, and of course a very strong market force through procurement, but also increasingly collaboration between public sector actors developing open source technologies together and as contributors in existing projects, which is a great development. And the OSPOs or other organizations within agencies are playing a key role in establishing this collaboration with the open source ecosystem, but also between actors in the public sector.
Yes, and actually, sorry, Aaron, go ahead.
Oh, I did actually have a quick question I wanted to interject there. As the OSPO name and function takes shape, in the meantime, have you seen a particular trend in lieu of having an OSPO formally, any particular department kind of picking up that role responsibility? Is it engineering? Is it legal? Is it someone else? I'm just curious.
So from my perspective, I've worked in different industry organizations, and the key problem here is that open source adoption is really an interdisciplinary challenge. So you have a dimension of open source as software technology, the building blocks that we're creating products from. You have one dimension as in business strategy, where you say, how do we bring products into the market? Where do we compete? Where do you collaborate? How do you generate value on top of open source components? And you have a legal aspect. This is all licensing of source code. So if you ask which of these is more important, you can only get wrong answers. Basically, you need all of these aspects working together. And that's why I think that's one of the reasons why many organizations just say, we don't place this in any one of the departments because that would give them too much weight in the process, and instead create a dedicated one. One alternative argument that I see a lot is, shouldn't the whole organization be ready to adopt open source? Shouldn't this be the responsibility of each function on their own? There's some value in this argument, and maybe as we progress with maturity, we may get there. But the argument is in a way similar to saying we just shouldn't need a legal department because everybody should just act according to the law anyway, right? And there we also see the justification for a dedicated group of experts. And maybe the same is true for open source. But generally, open source is becoming like product strategy for digital products includes open source today. You can't separate it anymore. Engineering management includes dealing with open source collaboration. So in many fields, it becomes just a part of the curriculum of skills that you have to master. And maybe over time, the OSPO role will be more a facilitator. Yeah, and in many places it already is. So we see evolvement based on the increasing maturity evolution, but less in a sense of that other departments would take over this role.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Adrian, you were going to say?
Yes, sorry, just before that, one of the interviewees mentioned a network of OSPOs for EU member states, and so kind of an idea of how OSPOs could give us a formalized structure for collaboration between member states, and so help EU collaboration in this space. And I think that was a very interesting idea.
Gotcha. Oh, yeah. Interesting. Cool. All right. Let's take a look at the next topic here. How's this impacting European startups and that ecosystem?
I think we are talking about the AI space and focused on this in the report, but actually I think in terms of just in general, what we're seeing in our surveys, sorry that I keep referencing to them, but that's what I'm working in, is that in general, people think that open source is very important to try to minimize the impact of large technological monopolies. And so they're seeing open source as a way to kind of um, offer alternatives to these very proprietary options, which are sometimes limited. And as we were saying in the AI space, it seems like even more concentrated. And so I think this is why it's so important, and but just also in general, but specifically for AI.
This is in line with findings from other research efforts like the impact of open source and standards development, where we see more small and medium-sized companies, including startups, participating in open source development as opposed to formal standards development organizations. And stated reasons there are lower barriers to entry and more accessible technology development processes. And for many participants here, the participation is actually a means for knowledge transfer. That means, of course, that if there's a lower barrier and you can already engage at a smaller size of your company in a reasonable way, then that's a more efficient way to learn about new upcoming technologies and to be able to create products that are innovative and surprisingly new at that time. So the impact of open source on the innovativeness of the economic environment, I think, cannot really be overstated. It's this aspect that all building blocks for your technology business are practically available at the start, and you can focus on whatever creates value on top that you are building. You don't have to work on the basics. This really creates a very competitive environment. And traditionally, the European economy is a bit more characterized by small, medium-sized companies as opposed to very big tech companies. And so, all things being equal, that would actually be a competitive advantage for European companies. On the other hand, the fact that we primarily compete with small, medium-sized companies also has disadvantages of size. I mean, that's clear.
Makes sense. All right, good stuff. Are you guys ready for the last topic?
Yes.
All right, here you go. All right.
Yes, I just wanted to give a bit more context to this question. So we did list loads of technologies, including AI and ML, which came as first, that the technology that would most benefit from being open source. And just so that people know what came after the list, second was operating systems with 40%. Third was cybersecurity with 30%, and the fourth was cloud and container technologies with 28%. So there were, I think, at least 10, 15 technologies listed, and most people cited AI ML. And so that's why we're highlighting it here. And I think we talked about this question with Mirko on how how these survey questions can actually, represent what people are thinking. And really, what this is showing, I think, is not kind of importance. I think open source is important for all of these technologies, but it's more about the current priorities, and what maybe this year's investments or strategy should focus on. And so definitely this year it was AI and ML.
I mean, everybody sees that you can't avoid the topic of AI at the moment. It's everywhere, and we are seeing really interesting breakthrough innovations in recent months, and probably will continue to see them, which makes this topic crucially important for the open source ecosystem as well, because as we know, many of the foundational technologies and even models are developed in an open source approach. And AI is new in a way that it's not just source code and software that we can license with the licenses that we know. And so a key aspect here is this question of what is actually an open AI system. And this is work in progress. It's made more important by the fact that the European AI Act, for example, has an exception for open sourced models or open source licensed models without actually providing a definition. And this is difficult now because we have a very well established and well respected open source software definition. But we don't have a similar and as mature definition for what is open source AI. There are currently two strands of work in progress here. One is the work of the open source initiative with the open source AI definition. And the other one is the model openness framework that the Linux Foundation has worked on. And they're complementary and basically are providing two different ways or complementary ways to assess the openness of AI systems. And the finding in the report basically highlights that we do need to come to some sort of a community agreement on what open source AI is to avoid that being open source, which is connotated with positive attributes, transparency and serving society as a whole, is used as a label for systems that aren't actually as open as they should be. This is work in progress. As the report says, there would be a lot of benefit, significant benefit from AI and machine learning being done in an open source approach, but we are still working on defining what exactly that means, basically.
Yeah, having that shared language, shared terminology, and meaning and definitions is so foundational. we gotta pin those down so that we can start making real progress in implementing it. Good stuff. That actually brings us. That was all 4 of the hot topics we wanted to address. We're slightly ahead of schedule. I'm gonna have to tell Gary that maybe he's too verbose, and without his presence here, we just blazed through it. So with Mirko and Adrian, thank you for being flexible and tackling those. But let's see what we got in the question panel really quickly. I do have one so far. Let's see if some more trickle in. But here's the first one. What can we do to foster the ecosystem? It's kind of an open question. I'm not sure how to add some more detail to that, but anything come to mind? There's a couple different ways you can run with that, I think.
I mean, I can go through a couple of thoughts that immediately come to mind, and one is the viability of the ecosystem in the sense of making sure that projects are properly maintained and secure. And here, basically everything that we do at the Linux Foundation is that we're hosting projects. All our projects are open for collaboration to any interested party, and we're taking care of, for example, creating funded projects as well, where the projects need that, through a membership-based model, and this is open also for everybody to participate. This model is quite viable, but there are other projects that don't have this strong support. Some of them because they evolved in a time when foundations weren't available or mature yet as they are today. Others because they like their independence. And we've recently seen, especially also through government initiatives, additional support for such projects. For example, with the German Sovereign Tech Fund that goes in and supports maintainers, for example, now. We see this as a great initiative, but not always is viability of the ecosystem the same as funding available. Often it's a question of are the community set up in the way that everybody who's interested to contribute can do that? A question of transparency and an open governance and a welcoming culture. And we're also investing a lot into that. Like, how do projects communicate about themselves? Are they inviting to people from different regions and different backgrounds? And I think this has become quite a focus in the open source ecosystem for good reasons, because we rely on everybody voluntarily contributing their time and effort to our projects. With the increasingly regulated environment for software, one thing that we do see is kind of a raised barrier to like the baseline requirements to governance an open source project is increasing a bit. Projects have seen more demands that they have to fulfill, for example, with working with authorities to mitigate software vulnerabilities and things like that. And that's one worry we have, is that not all projects will be equally able to shoulder these additional burdens. And open source maintainers are already rare and stressed in a way. So some more support may be needed here, but also the awareness that such additional burdens on volunteer developers or even companies participate voluntarily in open source development will impact the contributions that we're seeing in the projects. So as we move forward, everybody knows we need improved cybersecurity, more product reliability, and things like that. But as we move forward to regulating this space, we should also take care that we're not impacting the open source ecosystem in a way that we don't want.
Yes. And kind of the other strategy that's coming up a lot in our service, but also other research, was kind of a way to make sure that employers are allocating employee time to open source contributions, or even, offering full-time jobs, so that these people are able to maintain or contribute to the projects that are critical to these organizations. And so, well, one thing with the current economic situation is that we are seeing, a lot of employers asking, like, what's the value in this? Why should I spend so much money on people working on open source projects? So actually, with the Linux Foundation research, that's one of my aims for next year, is to figure out how we can measure this business value, so that open source contributors and employees can showcase this value, which I'm sure many of the organizations can see, but there are some who cannot, or their leadership cannot.
As you two were explaining that, there was a statistic from the report that I thought was pretty interesting and related to that. It was, I'm going to mess up the number, so maybe I'll just say X percent, and Adrian, you can probably find it. You probably know it off the top of your head, maybe. Some percent of respondents agreed that software developed with public funds should be open source, because it is public money, that it is that public code principle. I don't know, that just jumped out off the page of the report for me. Do you recall that one?
Yes. I think it was 82%.
Okay.
Or definitely above
That's a
80.
huge number. Yeah.
82 is correct.
Nice. Yes. Kind of one of the benefits of these surveys is that we're doing each year, is that we can ask, like, kind of focus areas, and this was actually a new question, and we didn't ask this last year. So yes, it was very interesting to see, and I think already kind of in the Global Spotlight report, you'll see that I kind of highlight Europe's role in I think identifying open source values and how it can then translate into the public sector, or how, I don't know, kind of the size societies in Europe are, organized, and I think that's a huge advantage, and I'm so glad that people recognize this. And so yes, that was for me it was a very positive result.
Yeah, and it highlights this public good character of open source software that's kind of inherent in open source licenses, but few people are aware of it. And this campaign, Public Money, Public Code, that we have referenced here, is actively trying to push this as a standard, which I do support. There is a qualitative and a quantitative difference if public actors would release the software that they develop or procure as open source software. One is reusability. I mean, it is probably one of the most sort of hidden reservoir of efficiency gains that we have in our society, is not to develop everything like for every municipality over and over again, or to buy the same software over and over again from the same proprietary vendors here. Every municipality, every county, every member state of the European Union will have to solve the same problems in serving their citizens. And there's a huge opportunity for collaboration here. And the key way to unlock that is to release what you develop once under the open source license, to say others can reuse that and build on it, or even collaborate directly with me and make a joint solution. And that's the bean counting, saying this is cheaper, we should do that. That's a quite clear argument. But there's another one that's more qualitative, and that is we talk a lot about digital sovereignty, about being able to control the infrastructure you're running and understand it. And for example, also change it if you think it's not operating the way you need it. And this requires technical expertise. And the best way to gain this technical expertise in today's world, where most products are 80% or more open source components, is to allow your own employees, your staff, your public servants to engage in the development process, because that's how they learn how the software works. That will only through this expertise, this knowledge about how software runs, can you make the decisions that are necessary to be sovereign in your operations. Otherwise, you're always depending on somebody else telling you how this should be run, and they probably recommend their own products. So there's this. We always use this argument when we say that open source should be used for teaching in schools as well. It's the same logic as students should be able to introspect how the software works that they're being taught. This will give them a higher level of understanding. And the same applies also to public actors here.
Awesome. Yeah, that's interesting. So actually, that we don't have any other questions at the moment right now. So, thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Mirko, for walking us through that. And again, everybody on the call, thank you for joining us. And the full report is at your disposal there in the chat. I'll be sure to make sure you get a copy in a follow-up email that comes with the recording of this conversation as well. So we hope this sparks some ideas and helps you address your own challenges going into 2025. And last thing up on the screen there, suggestions. We hope to bring thoughtful and insightful topics like this to you quarterly going into 2025. So if you have something on your mind that you'd love to see us tackle in an upcoming webinar, I would love it if you just shoot me an email and let me know to see how we can help. And also, last thing, if you do have some questions later that you ponder on after this conversation and you want me to see if I can field it through Adrian or Mirko, just send that to me and I'll take it from there. So again, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Adrian and Mirko, and everybody have a great rest of your day.